Hello, and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris,
I'm Randall.
and we are neither live nor we are from New York City, but today we're going to cover Saturday Night Live. Uh, hey, Randall,
Yes.
you're a big fan of the show, I assume,
Yeah, I've really liked it over the years. Yes.
and I am too, and I've been watching it ever since it was on the air. And we're going to talk about what we like and what we don't like, and we're going to try to break it down and offer a lot of opinions. And I'm hoping, if you're watching this, that we're going to say something that you're going to go, man, those guys really understand Saturday Night Live. They're geniuses. Or, oh my God, these people are so incredibly stupid and dumbass. I got to school them. So, if you like what we have to say, comment. If you don't like what we have to say, comment. If you want to hear more of our interesting and stupid and brilliant ideas, please subscribe wherever you subscribe, whether it's on comments or you're on podcasts, whatever. Follow us. Become a fan. If you say anything good or bad, we will comment on a future show. We'll give you the benefit of the doubt, and we will try to honor your point of view. Hey, Randall, what's the best way to leave a comment for the show?
Probably go to our Facebook page for the show. That's a good place to go. Lots of people leave comments there.
Or YouTube, or
You can go to YouTube or on YouTube. You go to our website. Go to chrisandrandall.com for how to get to all those places.
Yeah, we really want to know what you think, because I have a funny feeling that if you're listening to this particular episode or watching this episode, then you probably are familiar with Saturday Night Live. It's been on for do you realize it has been on for almost half a century?
Yep, it's been on a while.
The longest running variety. It is, I think it may be the longest running variety show, maybe the longest running sketch show, but it's an institution. And it's so funny because when I first started to watch it, none of that was the case. I actually saw it in the first season. I saw it, first episode I ever saw, I looked this up, was in November of 1976, when Candice Bergen was on the show as a host. I was 10 years old. My mom had a friend who called her up and said, hey, we should watch this show. And I was hooked right then and there. Now, I had to tell you that those early years of Saturday Night Live, from the 70s, if you were like ages 10 to 14, that was an amazing show because, Jim Henson of the Muppets, for the first season or two, they had these comedy Muppets. They had this thing called the Mr. Bill Show, which was a comedy of a claymation character where they would, he would get damaged and cut up into little pieces. Albert Brooks was making these crazy movies. Tom Schiller was making these crazy movies. They'd have people on like Steve Martin, and Steve Martin would do like comedy from his albums. And then he had a song called King Tut, and he dressed like King Tut, and he had the band, and Paul Schaefer was the band leader at the time, and they dressed like pharaohs. And even music-wise, I saw stuff I'd never seen, like Devo, Elvis Costello, Frank Zappa, Sun Ra. And, they were not the kind of things that you're going to hear on the radio. And you had certainly got to remember, folks, this was before videos came out. So it was wild. Just even the characters they would play, like John Belushi, who would play like a samurai who just kept on ending up doing weird things in different jobs and always cutting things up. It was crazy. It was not, I had been a big fan of Laugh-In, which had been on only literally 2 years earlier. So there was definitely a precedence, but Laugh-In was, I loved Laugh-In. I thought it was very funny, but I lived in New York City, and this was in New York City, and I felt like, man, these people are living in my world, and when they're making fun of a Greek diner where they got cheeseburger and no Coke and Pepsi, I'm like, yeah, I know what they're talking about. And when they do the opening credit sequences, they show scenes from New York, it and in the next day when you went back to school on Monday, you talk to your friends and you'd make fun of the cone heads. You do your impersonation of the land shark. Yeah, it was just I definitely like for the first couple years of my youth, it was my favorite show. I mean, I just could not wait until Saturday Night Live would come on. I'd watch all the reruns over this summer. They would sell books, which were like an inside background, and they show you the scripts and how they put together a scene. And when they started doing movies like Animal House, I was like, wow. And I went back and I bought the National Lampoon Radio Hour albums because they had people like Bill Murray and Chevy Chase and in the albums, John Belushi. I started reading National Lampoon because those guys were somehow associated with Saturday Night Live. I mean, it opened doors. It was definitely. I mean, I had already been a big fan of Monty Python, but those guys were British, so the comedy they were doing was brilliant. But I didn't see how the comedy they did had any basis in my own world. And the other comics that I had liked, like Mel Brooks, his comedies, they were for grown-ups. Like Saturday Night Live was the first time. It was obviously not for my generation because I'm 10 years old, but these people were young-ish. They were like the big brothers, the cool hip 20-somethings that were, not ready for prime time. They were like really big kids. How about you? What was
Well, let me ask you a couple questions.
Years? Yeah, go ahead.
Because, yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, I mean, my first experience with watching SNL was, I think it was in syndication. They had like, they distilled like a half an hour of best of. Yeah. They distilled best of down to a half an hour, and they showed it in syndication. That, yeah. And me and my friends watched a lot of that when I was a kid. I don't even remember staying up late and watching the actual show very much. It was mostly just a syndication. So we watched. How
old were you when you got to actually watch Saturday Night Live, like live?
It's probably in high school. I first watched it. Probably my friends were watching it. Yeah, there was definitely a time in high school. It was like the Phil Hartman years. There was definitely a time in high school. Phil Hartman, Dana Carvey, Mike Myers, when us kids were all into it.
You were gonna ask me a question.
Yeah, so I had a couple questions. So do you think in the early years SNL was a little bit more experimental? I mean, I definitely think that.
Oh
myself.
Yeah, it was so experimental because it didn't really know what it was yet. So like, they'd ever have sometimes the popular musicians, but then they would like deliberately get people like Sun Ra. Who the hell knew who Sun Ra was, or Captain Beefheart, or Frank Zappa? Or, like, why would they have Muppets on for a year? And,
yeah, I've read that,
they have these, like, short films.
Right. Yeah, I've read that Lorne Michaels,
yeah,
he didn't...
go ahead.
Yeah, Lorne Michaels, he didn't... he had some crazy ideas at the beginning. Like, they thought that maybe they would have George Carlin as the resident stand-up, and he would just do stand-up the whole time. They would not have, like, rotating hosts. But that ended pretty quickly.
Yeah, sometimes they'd have, like, a stand-up just come on and do like 5 minutes of stand-up in the middle of the show, or a magician do magic for 5. Harry Anderson came on once and just did magic comedy for 5 minutes. It had, I mean, the only things about Saturday Night Live pretty much from the beginning was it always had an opening monologue, it always had Weekend Update, it always had a musical guest who would appear twice, and the entire cast would always come out at the end of the show. And other than that, there really was no sense that you knew what it was going to be like from season to season, much like episode to episode.
Yeah, and one of the early cast members, I think, was Andy Kaufman, maybe the first person.
Well, he wasn't a cast member. He appeared on the show briefly, but not very long. He was not an original cast member.
Well, actually, from what I've read, I mean, maybe you're right, but from what I've read, if I remember right, he was the first actual cast member Lorne Michaels hired, because that was, and if you know anything about Andy Kaufman, he was like one of the most avant-garde stand-ups of all time. I'm a big fan.
He must have been a guest. He was not a member of the Not Ready for Primetime Players. I'm sorry.
Okay,
he probably appeared. He might have been hired.
I'm just talking about from. Okay, cast. I'm just talking about from my memory. So he was the first cast member, but maybe other people can look this up. But So that's the kind of idea that Lorne Michaels had. He wanted to make something fresh and new, and like you're saying, like it was very adventurous in the beginning, right? And then as
The
time
original
goes,
lineup was Chevy Chase, Dan Aykroyd, John Belushi, Garrett Morris, Jane Curtin, Lorraine Newman, and Gilda Radner. That was the original not ready for prime time players lineup. Those, not talking about the writers now or anybody else, but that was the group that you would see every week
okay,
until Chevy Chase left, and then
and
he was
it's
replaced by Bill Murray.
right, and they had Jim Henson on. I think Jim Henson was the first season. I
Yeah,
want to
just
say, or
the
maybe the
first
second
season.
season. But
Uh,
anyway, Jim Henson was supposed to be a feature of the show too, and it never worked, right? I mean, it's
Well, it's
interesting.
weird because they were not the Muppets like you know them. They were a Muppet-like group of lizard people who lived in a primeval era. So they did about 4 or 5 episodes of this weird tribe, and I think it was supposed to be social commentary. Uh, I'll be honest with you, all of the jokes completely went over my head. It's probably the only time, by the way, that the Jim Henson Company has ever tried to get into adult humor.
So,
So I give
so
them
even
that
as a
much.
kid, you didn't like those segments.
Oh, I like them because I thought this is really cool. They're in a primitive tribe. They're doing stuff, but I didn't realize that it was being used as social commentary. The grown up satire went over my head. I was able to appreciate it on a much more juvenile level. I would definitely say that the 1970s Saturday Night Live, and I think it is a reflection maybe of the boomer sensibility. Keep in mind, I mean, I don't know if every season of Saturday Night Live people did a lot of drugs, but I feel like you could tell in the 70s they did a lot of drugs because there was a lot of hallucinatory humor, like the land shark, like the coneheads, where I think they were really pushing the boundaries of absurdism in a way that as a kid you love. I mean, I think that comedy looks very different to the child's mind, right? Like when you're 10 years old, 12 years old, 14 years old, I think things like sex and pooping, and I think how corrupt politicians are and adults, there's a feeling kind of crazy about that humor. Like it validates your feelings.
Hey, Chris, it just struck me. I was when you're talking about watching as a kid. Do you think SNL somehow caters to a younger crowd? Like the humor is simplified for kids, maybe?
That's a great question because, on one hand, I think SNL would like you to think that they cater to young adults and that, like, hey, we cater to people in their 20s. And I'm not saying they are not trying, but I do think when you are in that golden age of adolescence and teen years, comedy means so much more to you. Mark Maron has a theory that everybody's favorite cast is either the cast during high school or college. I'll get to that in a moment, but I do think like when you turn like, for me, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, those adolescent years, not only was I a comedy geek, but I think every kid that age is a comedy geek because you're really curious about the world of adults. And I think that humor kind of is a leveling effect, because it makes adults look stupid, which makes you feel kind of cool and hip. And I mean, again, I do feel like the humor very specific to my time. So like if I look at, the 70s and early 80s, which is my period of Saturday Night Live, they really did go after like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Gumby, Land Sharks. Jerry Ford was always getting into Pratt Falls. They did one where like Jimmy Carter went to 3 Mile Island and he came up a giant. I mean, it was very much the level of satire humor was definitely one that a kid could easily get. The humor was accessible, low humor. When you're a kid, I think also you're always being forced to behave. So the fact that you're watching adults behaving badly, Saturday Night Live's best performers, like a John Belushi, were really like clowns, and clowns are like big kids. And you have to understand. For me, it's a little different maybe than for you, coming in when it was a brand new show. But like, comedy on TV was just sitcoms for the most part. So like when I'm watching a sitcom, no one is really that zany. They're normally like Happy Days was like the reigning comedy, and Three's Company was the reigning comedy. So there weren't like boffo clowns on that show. And yeah, I'd watch like the Rich Little Show or Laugh-In or the Tonight Show, and they'd have stand-up comics come in or they'd do a funny sketch. But it was all very topical. It was all, I hate to say it, but it was all for grown-ups. So for me, it was like half funny, but not zany. I think when you're a kid, you really like cartoons, not by accident, because that's how you see the world. How about you, man? I mean, when you were watching it, how old were you when you were watching those half hours?
I might have been around 10, and
Yeah.
I remember really keying into, I think it was Albert Brooks's shorts. Like there was one about a kid who ate refrigerator magnets, and there was one about a guy who, there used to be, people don't know this today, but when you go to the grocery store or a business like that and the door automatically opens, now there's like a device over the door that that senses your motion. But it used to be there was a rubber mat on the ground in front of the door, and you had to step on the rubber mat, and then the door would open. Do you remember that, Chris?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So there was an Albert Brooks short, I think it was Albert Brooks, and this guy got this idea where he cut the rubber out of one of those mats and put him on the bottom of his shoes, and he walked around town, and every door was opening for him everywhere he went. I remember just as a kid loving those things, Mr. Bill especially.
I had the album. I still do. It was a book, a picture book with photos of Mr. Bill, plus a little plastic album that you could play. And okay, I'm sorry for those of you who are younger. Mr. Bill was a clay man, and because he was made out of clay, he had a pet named Spot, right, a dog, and Mr. Bill and Spot, they would constantly get killed and destroyed by real objects. It was the product of a man named Michael O'Donoghue, who had come from the National Lampoon, who had the darkest, most sardonic sense of humor ever. Please,
Mr. Bill's
go on
kind of
YouTube, look it up, man. You'll love it.
Mr. Bill's kind of a parody of a children's show, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting because I know as a kid that was like my first introduction to SNL, but at some point SNL really dropped the shorts. I mean, I know they kept doing some of them over the years, but they really dropped them until the Lonely Island guys came in.
They kept the shorts. So what happened was this: people like Tom Schiller, Albert Brooks were doing digital shorts in the 70s and early 80s.
Well, they were digital shorts. They were like film, right? They were actual shorts.
Exactly. So what happens in the 80s, which is not bad, is they start doing film parodies that are like more like commercials and less like short films. They're really funny. There was one for Gaddafi done to the Jordache look. There was one. Oh
yes, I remember those now. Yeah, so each episode would have like one camera parody with editing and everything, right?
And they were brilliant. But
it was usually a fake commercial, and it happened after the host talked, right? It was
exactly.
It would try to fool you into thinking it was a real commercial.
Yes, yeah. Then they went into the 90s because there's a great one with Chris Farley and Adam Sandler for like, it's just there's two young guys, it's a beer commercial, but they're at like a pool surrounded by gorgeous gay men.
It's a beer commercial for gay men, and it's classic, right? It's one of the best.
They play a Van Halen song. I can't remember which one it was. It was like the perfect, like, so yeah, I mean, it's a trade-off because I agree with you. Those short films up until you get to Lonely Island, which you should get to in a bit, were not quite as, they weren't cinematic in scope, but the parodies were just brilliant. I will say in answer to Mark Maron's point that for me, I think Eddie Murphy was the height of it for me. I think when I was in high school in 81, I'm watching it in my dorm in high school because I went to a boarding school, and I saw Eddie Murphy do all of those great characters like Mr. Rogers and Gumby and Buckwheat and James Brown. And I think, Eddie Murphy, it's unfortunate because he set up some very things that would, I think, hurt Saturday Night Live. Because when he was on that show, even though Joe Piscopo was pretty darn funny, I would argue that most of the seasons that Eddie Murphy was on the show, it was less of an ensemble show and more a delivery vehicle for Eddie Murphy.
Would you say,
like the 81 to 84 years?
You could say, now correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to ask you, do you think Eddie Murphy is the only black breakout actor from SNL?
Well, that's a great question too.
Because I think he is.
Eddie Murphy, Chris Rock clearly is a very popular, is a god among comics.
I love Chris Rock, but I think even
breakout.
I think even Chris Rock would admit that he was not successful on that show.
No, he was not successful on that show, and I think Eddie Murphy. There's two problems for African American actors who would follow Eddie Murphy, which is that, and this is not an expectation you normally even hold for Saturday Night Live people, but Eddie Murphy was a brilliant stand-up comic who could do brilliant stand-up comedy, a very little of which he ever bothered to do on SNL. But he was also a brilliant comic actor who could do great characters. And normally when you see African-American performers on Saturday Night Live, they either fall into the stand-up category like a Jay Farrow or a Leslie Jones, who are very funny as stand-ups, but not particularly good at playing characters, or you get someone like Tim Meadows, Tracy Morgan, Kenan Thompson, who are really great at playing characters, but not particularly good at stand-up. So he has set up an unfortunate expectation that I honestly think no one who's followed him has really been able
I forgot about Leslie Jones. I think Leslie Jones could be the second most successful black performer on SNL. And I just want to say something about Eddie Murphy's SNL. I mean, I don't know how long it's been since you've watched his old sketches, but like
I every so often I'll just watch them on YouTube just to make me smile.
Do you don't think they're like they're problematic at all in like the modern SJW sense?
I don't know, to be honest with you, with Eddie Murphy, because he is part of an oppressed society group. So it's a little harder to draw those lines. I think the one where he pretended to be white and he goes out in the world and people see him so much better. I would argue just the opposite. I think if you are from that world of the left, it was pretty mind-blowing back then, and it still works today.
Well, I just want to say something that really strikes me. Like if you watch Eddie Murphy's old SNL stuff, especially that one where he the short you're talking about where he pretends to be white, or he masquerades as a white person and he sees what it's like to be white in the world.
Yeah,
that's amazing. But something that really strikes me about his stuff on SNL was just how deeply he explored the black experience in America. Okay, and almost all of his characters, everything he did on SNL was just concerned what it was like to be black in America. And I don't think any of the other black performers on SNL have ever gone into that territory before. I mean, in a certain way, he was political, very political. I think Chris Rock tried to do that a little bit, especially with his I think it was Nat X sketches that I thought were really good.
Because you get 5 minutes because that's all the man will allow. I mean, there is a good point, and I don't know if we can ever really put the onus on any of the African American performers, because it also really has to do with the writing staff and the sensibility of the show. And I will say, if you look at Saturday Night Live today, it is a much more diverse cast than it has ever been in its history. I mean, Joe Piscopo used to pretend to be Jesse Jackson. That would not fly today.
Well, Eddie Murphy, he confronted him being black head on the show, and that gave him a lot of success. And it's interesting to me, I think he's a good example of how the show has become seems to have become less edgy and political as the years have gone on. I
Well,
mean,
let's get back to that in a little while, but let's just stay in the past for a moment, just to keep the show thematic in sections. But I think that what Eddie Murphy did is he introduced a sense of danger in his choices that I think was also there in the 70s. But in a way, maybe he was also, I think, the end of that era. You know what I'm saying? Because I feel like
yeah,
after
so
Eddie
he's at the tail
Murphy,
end of like the 70s, the political upheaval of that era. Yes.
yeah,
Yeah,
and I feel like after him, it's weird to say this, but Saturday Night Live for the first 5 years, first 6 years, was struggling to stay on the air. It was very low rated. It was always in threat of cancellation. In 1980, Lorne Michaels leaves Saturday Night Live, is replaced by a woman named Jean Dominion, whose only claim to fame is she's friends with Woody Allen. And it's a disastrous season. That's the one that Gilbert Gottfried, by the way, was on.
what year was
Then
that?
80, the 80-81 season, just considered the worst in history, almost went off the air. Dick Ebersol, who was a producer at NBC Sports, is brought in to run the show in 81, and he's the one who puts people like Piscopo and Eddie Murphy and Julie Louis-Dreyfus in, and kind of gives it a one more shot. Hires a lot of people from improv, makes some great choices, let's be honest. He's actually never been given the credit he's due. But weirdly enough, because I think Eddie Murphy really brings so much attention to the show, both, and remember that he would do these comedy albums and movies like 48 Hours and Trading Places simultaneously with being on SNL, that it goes from being a show that's barely on the rocks to beginning its ascendance into a money-making, profitable machine for NBC, where it will become an institution. By the end of the 80s, Saturday Night Live would be like The Tonight Show, just a permanent fixture on the NBC list, never going to go away. In fact, let me ask you about this, because we're about 10 years apart. So first off, you think Maron's right? In your opinion, was your favorite cast period high school and college, or for you, is that not the case?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think the show it's consciously tries to cater to an 18 to I don't know 30 crowd somewhere in there. And I remember reading about Mad TV. Mad TV, when it was on, was consciously trying to cater to a younger crowd than SNL. So you're talking like something around 14 to 18, something in there. That's why Mad TV was frequently criticized for seemingly being dumber than SNL,
Oh, it was like they
because
had
it
a
was
show called
intentional.
Fridays on ABC, which actually featured Michael Richards and Larry David before that, and that was their ABC's attempt. So there's been a number of attempts at following their lead. I don't think for myself, because in fairness, Eddie Murphy leaves while I'm in high school, and I lose interest. And then when I go to college, even though they have great people like Robert Downey Jr. and Randy Quaid and Christopher Guest and Billy Crystal, who's actually very funny, I'm not really paying attention to Saturday Night Live when I'm in college, because, hey, folks, I'm in college. I got better shit to do. I'm in college. Why am I wasting my valuable years watching an SNL? But once I got out of college, for me, one of my favorite periods, which is that late 80s, mid 90s, the Phil Hartman, Jan Hooks, John Lovitz, that period where they brought in all of these people from like improv, especially from the Groundlings. You actually were talking about this particular generation.
Yeah, so that period is interesting. I feel that's a very unusual period. I mean, I think I don't know. I think maybe you gotta objectively say that's one of the greatest casts ever. But
absolutely,
it's because that season, I think they were struggling, and they decided to hire older people who had more experience in comedy, who had proven themselves in theatrical comedy settings. So they brought in Phil Hartman. Phil Hartman was one of the oldest hires of the show ever. And like I think
until
I read
Leslie Jones. She was hired at like 45.
I think I read somewhere that Phil Hartman was practically going to retire from doing comedy because he had been kicking around the comedy scene in theaters for a while, and he felt he was getting too old, and then and then SNL gave him the call. But yeah, so they consciously tried to hire some more experienced people who had a repertoire, who had proven themselves, who knew what they were doing. So that's why that was so good, you know, in a sense. Um,
That's like the period. Also, I forgot to mention people like Dana Carvey, uh, Nora Dunn. I mean, you're really talking about a lot. And I would say this period goes from like the late '80s almost to the end of the '90s, because it's this very neat period where you have. And you're right. They're older. They're more seasoned. Uh, they come with characters that they've already spent years establishing, and that's why like the liar comes from John Lovitz's time in the Groundlings. Uh, so something is a really important thing I think to talk about in the structure of Saturday Night Live is Saturday Night Live really has three basic food groups when it comes to their cast and their writers. They have people who are from stand-up comedy, they have people who are from improv, and then they have just a few people who are just comedic actors. Christian Ebersol is one of the comedic actors when I think of that. Or there was a year where they had Anthony Michael Hall and Robert Downey Jr., Randy Quaid, all comedic actors. But I think what really have always been for me the strongest periods of Saturday Night Live, which would be first generation, this generation, and then I think for me that first generation that came out in the first decade of this century, the Will Ferrell, Tina Fey, Amy Poehler's, is when they really lean heavily into people from improv. I think that the improv people really bring a lot to SNL.
what
What
do
do
you
you
say?
think?
Do you think that's because they have acting chops?
They have acting talks and they have technique. In fact, this is a good time to maybe kind of talk about our own backgrounds, because here's a shocking surprise. Randall, when I was a young person, from the time I was a child to the time I was well into my 30s, I won't lie. I wanted to either be a writer for Saturday Night Live or a performer for Saturday Night Live. And needless to say, if you were watching this show, you know exactly how that didn't turn out. But, I studied improv here in Los Angeles with a number of places. I had one teacher named Cynthia Seghetti who taught a lot of famous people who did go on to Saturday Night Live. I also studied at the Groundlings, where a lot of people from Saturday Night Live. I definitely got to see, how you go about creating characters, building sketches. And when you watch Saturday Night Live from an improv perspective, you're going, oh, well, that's a character they developed over a series of time. Even Weekend Update is simply based on a thing where the audience makes a suggestion about stuff that's going on in the news, and then you build a beginning, middle, and end story based on that as reporters. Just scenes and wordplay and games. They call it a game. Really are the building blocks of a lot of that. I will say that she said to me, and it broke my heart, said, oh, if you're 35, don't even think about going after Saturday Night Live. You never will. But then at the same time, I remember that Jimmy Fallon got into trouble because he was in Groundlings, which is these improv groups are schools, and they normally have like 4 or 5 levels. And he only made it to the intermediate level when he decided he was going to audition for Saturday Night Live. And Will Ferrell, same deal. He didn't make it all the way to the very end before he ended up on Saturday Night Live. So there's this feeling when you're in an improv school that you have to follow the rules to the letter if you don't. But you did sketch writing with a famous Saturday Night Live writer.
Well, his name was, he passed just earlier this year. His name was Michael McCarthy. And he was on the disastrous 80-81 season, I believe, that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he was one of my teachers. I knew him pretty well. I knew him outside of class. I worked with him on a sketch comedy show we did at the IO West called Big News that turned into Top Story Weekly. He founded that show. He made the show. The show was completely topical. It was a topical. I mean, you can watch it online if you want. It was a topical news show. But it was very much in the format of modern Saturday Night Live. People submitted sketches, and they selected which sketches to do. And they did new show every week. And I mean, it was the news. It was the topical news version of Saturday Night Live. um, yeah, he was a great guy. What'd you want to know about him, Chris?
Well, I mean, what insights did he give you to just the way the show worked?
Well, I mean, you can read a lot of books and find out how SNL works.
What was
I,
his personal take?
I well, the thing I remember most, you know, it's interesting. He stepped away from doing the top story show, the big news show, quite early. If you compare it to the entire run of the show ran for about over 10 years on the stage. Um,
Your improv, the improv program that he created, big news, top story,
it's a show. It was a weekly show, and it
and they
ran
made
for.
fun of what was going on in the news. Or...
That's right. It made fun of what was going on in the news. He had set it up so that it nearly ran itself after he left. So and he based it around the SNL model. So you know the SNL model. I mean, and he was on SNL in the '80s, right? In the early '80s, and SNL's still using the same model to generate their content. So I mean, it really shows that whatever SNL is doing, it works. I mean, if you
You
want
know,
to,
you're right. It's a very the Weekend Update is probably one of the most technically tightest, most consistent, and ever evolving formulas on the show. Wouldn't you say? I mean, if you look at it from the very beginning, when it was Chevy Chase, and then it was Dan Aykroyd and Jane Curtin, to now with Michael Che and Colin Jost, you can see a really interesting line.
right? Well, the show I'm talking about was like mostly a sketch show, but yeah, I did have like a fake news parody segment. It was half sketch and half local news parody.
Oh, you're talking about just the way they generate their. I'm so sorry. You meant the way they just generate their sketches. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it's weird because do you think, a lot of TV writing has changed over the years? Like you rarely see a 3-camera sitcom anymore, or like sitcoms where they're like, hey, I'm going to say a piece of dialogue and it's a setup for a joke. And hey, I'm going to react by giving you the punchline. Like so much of comedy today is changed, even the style of comedy. But you are right. Like a Saturday Night Live sketch today is structurally speaking almost identical to what it was in 1975.
Well they have a system. Saturday Night Live and the show I worked on, they have a system for generating content, and they have writers write sketches, and then they do an open read of all the sketches, and then they pick some of them, and then and we didn't used to do this, but Saturday Night Live they perform the sketches twice in front of an audience, and then they cut. I think they cut like a bunch of sketches out that they've performed. So at each step they cut out more sketches, and then when they finally get to air, that's like the third time they perform the sketch, and those are the final sketches. I mean, they sometimes I think it's rare, but they have sometimes cut sketches on the third run on SNL because they're just so terrible. But usually they've made it at that point. But it's so it's an interesting process because it's a good way to generate a lot of content, I guess you could say, and to reliably generate the content every week. And yeah, so this is why in SNL's history the shorts and some of the other more thought out content, it's taken a back seat to the live sketches, because live sketches are the system SNL has for generating live sketches. It's great for making a lot of them, and they just churn them out. And
I think the live dynamic is certainly worth. Let's address that because it's live. I know for me, growing up in New York City, I was watching that East Coast feed at 11:30, and maybe they had like a 5 minute delay. I think once Richard Pryor got on, he started saying things you're not supposed to say. There is an actual delay on Saturday Night Live, but not a big delay. And it's weird because, in fairness, like if you've ever watched a talk show, it's normally filmed in front of a live studio audience as well. But and if you watch a sporting event, that is live happening in front of you. In fact, I think that's why Dick Ebersol got the job. But I remember watching it knowing that there was a hint of danger. Like if you saw a performer playing a character and maybe their prop mustache falls off or they break, because they just start laughing, uncontrollably. I know you're not allowed to ad lib on that show, but I just watched recently. This at the taping of this show is November, early November. It's November 10th. So I just watched Dave Chappelle, and there's a scene with him and Pete Davidson, and I almost felt like he was improvising with Pete Davidson about Pete Davidson's mouth, like a stand-up comic would do. Totally not in the scene or anything, and I watched Pete Davidson break over that. I don't know. Could have been scripted. I don't know, but it is those moments. I saw Elvis Costello when he decided to change the song that he was going to do from Oliver's Army, and he switched it over to Radio. He got banned from Saturday Night Live for 12 years because he didn't do what he was supposed to do. Or there's that famous one with Ashley Simpson, right, where her you find out that she's recorded. I don't know. Do you feel like the live element on that show adds a layer to the watching of it?
Oh yeah, I definitely do. I mean, SNL is an old format. It goes back, pre-vaudeville, even the sketch comedy format and live music, of course, and it just it wouldn't be the same without a live audience, right? It wouldn't be the same without the feeling that they're actually showing you what happened live in the studio. There have been sketch comedy shows like Monty Python and such. Ben Stiller. There have been sketch comedy shows that are one camera. They shoot them for the camera, and yeah, it's just not the same, right? I mean, there's something about, especially comedy. There's something about the genre of comedy. It's good to hear actual other people laughing, right? Like you're part of a group of people laughing at something. That's why they put in the laugh tracks in sitcoms, right?
All right, but it's a live audience that just has an applause sign. I mean, it's weird to admit that now I just watch it the next day on YouTube, not even in sequence. I just select what I like and watch that. How about yourself? Do you watch it as a program now, or do you just watch the selected pieces?
Well, yeah, I mean, because of the delay, I don't think there's any reason to watch it as it airs on TV. I do like to watch the whole show, though, but I haven't watched it in a while. Yeah. I mean, the last time I was watching the whole show was when Alec Baldwin was doing it as Trump. I guess he's back, but I haven't started watching it again.
It's really interesting also because I do feel like the weaker sketches are around the end of the show. Yeah. And I sometimes feel like the energy level, mind you, it's 12:30 at night, sometimes 12:45. It feels like the energy level sometimes is also dropping as the show progresses. But it is weird. Like, I just saw this one. We should get to the monologues. This is probably a good way to go. Right now, at this period, because we're recording during COVID, they don't have the traditional guest hosts come out and promote things. They're just now getting hosts. And for whatever reason, they've been doing a lot of stand-up comics. And we'll get into the monologues in a minute, but Bill Burr did one of the earlier episodes this season, and you could just see he was sweating, he was getting lost, he was reacting to the audience. It wasn't bad, but it was like really being in a comedy club, and you were, it wasn't like watching someone come on and do their tight five on the Tonight Show, where like, hey, everybody, I'm Jerry Seinfeld, boom, boom, boom. It was more like he was working the crowd, trying to make people laugh, getting upset when people weren't, like not realizing, millions of people are watching you right now on live TV. Uh, and I kind of like that. I kind of like the nervous energy of a performer. Uh, Sometimes because it makes you realize that you are watching. I guess I hate to say it's a little bit of bread and circuses, but the monologue. Okay, best and worst part of the show, I would argue. How about you? How do you feel about the monologue?
I've never liked the monologue.
You've never liked the monologue. Well, that's
No.
never. There's never been a good monologue ever in the 45-year history of Saturday Night Live.
I mean, they're all right. I mean, comics will come up and do material, and sometimes they'll do a bit, and I don't know. They've never been they've never been the most.
You don't like
interesting
it
part
when
of the
they
show
have
to
like
me.
a really funny person, like Chris Rock just did one. It was pretty funny. Dave Chappelle just did the longest monologue ever, 16 solid minutes.
All right, I'm
On
gonna
the
have to watch
Truffle
it. But
Ledger.
yeah, I mean, when the comics write material specifically for the monologue and they're never gonna do it again, that can be good. Um,
I do think that the comics have an unfair advantage, and first off, I 100% disagree with you. I sometimes like it when they do big, crazy musical numbers, or they just do very wacky things that are over the top. But I will also say that sometimes they'll have someone who's just not an inherently funny person. Maybe they're a screen actor, a TV actor, or a musician or celebrity who doesn't really have a live performer's background, and you can tell they're reading the script like like that, and then the ensemble people are trying to support them by coming up and making a joke, or you can tell like it's not working.
I almost wish they would just stick another sketch right there, but
I like a
it's
good
just
monologue.
me.
I like a good monologue. It just depends on who it is. I mean, I right now the monologues have been pretty good because I've had a lot of stand-ups. If it was Alec Baldwin, he's normally funny. Steve Martin was always funny. Billy Crystal, John Mulaney. Really the funny people are funny people. But even someone like Emma Stone, I think tends to give a pretty good monologue because she's a funny actress. And sometimes people you would never expect. But I feel like the show, when you're watching the Tonight Show or any of the talk shows on weekday nights, they have people who've made their careers in doing stand-up and improv. So by the time they're in front of you, not only have they have the top writers, but they understand delivery. And I often wonder, maybe you're right. Maybe the monologue just does not work with people who don't have that skill. Do you think that Saturday Night Live is more daring in the modern age or more self-censoring?
Well, we've definitely covered this a little bit already in this conversation. I mean, you admit that it was more adventurous in the early days, more experimental. I mean, Saturday Night Live has definitely become very formulaic. I mean, when I worked with Michael McCarthy on the sketch comedy show we did at IO West, I mean, he had a formula down that I'm sure he never said it to me, but I'm sure he stole it from SNL, and we just followed it, and we followed it even after he left for years and years. The formula works. And you just generate a bunch of sketches and you pick the best ones and you put them up.
But do you think they're more controversial or more self-centered? I mean, that's really what I'm saying. Do you feel like...
Well, the interesting thing about SNL, okay, now I think we're going to disagree on this, but I think the interesting thing about SNL is that they have this whittling process, right, where they start with a lot of sketches. They table read them, then they cut some, and then they perform them from an audience. They cut some, they perform from an audience again, they cut some, and then they go to the show. And they're just cutting sketches that aren't getting laughs, or I mean, there may be other reasons why they cut sketches, but comedy is a very subjective thing, and when you are just playing for laughs, I think you do get to a much more neutral position, like politically, ideologically, artistically. I mean, I don't think that you can make the argument that artistically, aesthetically speaking, SNL takes a lot of risks. I mean, especially with the whittling process of the sketches. I mean, when risks are taken, I feel they come from what you're talking about, like when stand-ups come into a monologue that they've just written for SNL, or when they have an act on the show that when they have somebody on the show that's just going to do their act, like a stand up or Andy Kaufman or something, uh, and that act just comes from that performer. I mean, that's the edgiest SNL gets.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think that short of music, the real risky stuff is when they have a stand-up come on and do a monologue. In fact, just something Chappelle said was like, "Oh, I thought we were doing a comedy," but I forgot what he said. It was something like, "Oh man, Dave, he made a joke about how COVID makes life better." And the audience turned on him. It was the second time this year I've watched the audience turn on a comic. And he said, "Oh, excuse me, I thought we were on a comedy show." But he turned right back on them, which I kind of really enjoyed. But I think that you cannot. I do think that Saturday Night Live plays to a cultural elite. I do think they play to a middle class, college educated, coastal person who is a socially liberal Democrat, if not really an economically liberal Democrat. And I think that if you're that kind of person, which I sometimes am, I sometimes wear my Whole Foods hat on, my New Yorker NPR listening. I'm like, oh man, they really took a hard shot at Donald Trump. They took a really hard shot at the Republicans. But in truth, I think that Saturday Night Live knows who their watchers are, and they often preach to the converted. So something that feels daring isn't daring at all because they know their audience is already on their side.
Well, let me just say about the whittling process. They're doing 2 rounds of sketches in front of an audience, in front of their live audience. That audience is New York's upper crust, usually, isn't it? I mean,
not really. No,
who is that audience, Chris?
It's. I'll be honest with you. It's a 2-year wait to get tickets. And most of the people who go are the same people who went to see Mamma Mia. They're people from out of town who years ago tried to get tickets to catch the show, flew to New York, stayed at a hotel just to watch the show. This is not. I know, man. It's not a gathering.
Is that true? Because
it's 100% true.
I thought I've read somewhere that it's like
a fantasy. It's not a Woody Allen movie.
It's like who you know to get on. It's like who you know to get on the show.
No, I mean 1 or 2 tickets, sure, but most of the audience are just people who've waited 2 years to watch the show and from all over the world, and they want to go to New York City and see an actual taping of Saturday Night Live so they can tell their friends in Butte, Montana. But the watchers of the show, the people, look, a lot of people who write for that show, who perform in that show, they went to places like Harvard, they wrote for the Lampoon, they came out of stand-up, they come out of improv, they come from good universities and colleges. And let's be blunt, they're a class of people who are going to almost always skew liberal, socially progressive. I don't think these are bad things, don't get me wrong, but I do feel that when there is a Republican in president, when they can do a Bush, when they can do a Trump, when they can do a Reagan, they do great. They are really funny. They're really spot on. They really understand. Weekend Update is almost always really strong in those times. But when you have like a Clinton or an Obama, and I think even now with Biden, you'll start to see it gets really soft. They don't, in all the time that Joe Biden has been our vice president, Jason Sudeikis, who I think is a tremendously talented performer. I'm really watching. Have you been watching Ted Lasso, by the way?
No, I don't think so.
Great show. Go watch it. He's wonderful in it. But his Joe Biden was just kind of an avuncular, nice guy. And it was a very softball, just like Obama was very softball. But now Jim Carrey as Joe Biden is just terrible. Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it yet.
He's playing it like Jim Carrey from the 90s doing The Mask. Like he's insane. It's just all Jim Carrey. And I can see the way they're doing Kamala Harris. I love Maya Rudolph. She's really brilliant. But again, it's Saturday Night Live, a struggle whenever it comes time to go against their own people. They don't know how to attack the left. They don't know how to go after liberal views. They don't know. And by the way, you can be liberal and you can make fun of liberal views. You can laugh at yourself. I think you and I try as much as possible to make, I'm a pretty left of center guy, but I'm definitely willing to laugh at that. Saturday Night Live Now the good news is it's a more diverse cast. I think certain kinds of humor that was inherently offensive, they don't do anymore. So you have to kind of weigh the bad with the good, I guess. But let's talk about how Saturday Night Live has influenced late night talk shows, because now, it used to be that they were the enemy of Carson, and Letterman was kind of in between. But now look at it: you've got Seth Meyers, Jimmy Fallon.
Well, I
You have people
believe
who are literally hosting evening
right. Well,
shows.
I believe a couple of years back, a few years back, NBC just gave Lorne Michaels all of late night for the whole week. That's why you have Jimmy Fallon and Seth Meyers hosting those shows. That's all like Lorne Michaels block every night now. So SNL took over. SNL is like the establishment now.
And even on the shows with Jimmy Kimmel, because Kimmel is very similar in a Saturday Night Live way. He comes from Comedy Central. Stephen Colbert, who comes from The Daily Show, which is also in the vein of Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update. You now have these guys in their 40s and 50s who are very smart, very edgy, very observant. I think it's fair to say that, once Saturday Night Live became both an institutional show, it would also start creating its own institution of a late night talk show. Just like, look how it's affect film and television.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, I think a lot of the success of SNL goes back to their model for generating content. Like we've already discussed. I mean, it's just they turn it's kind of like Warhol's factory. They've turned sketch comedy into a factory, and they just churn it out.
Oh,
And
but you've been repeating that point a lot, so I'm going to really press you a little bit harder on that, because I don't think it's simply, look, they're highly inconsistent, and there are good seasons and bad seasons. There are good episodes in bad seasons. There are weak episodes in good seasons. What do you think makes for a really solid sketch? Give me a sketch that you really liked on Saturday Night Live anytime in the last couple of years, a new one, not from like in the last 10 years.
well, I like all the Alec Baldwin sketches. I mean, I think that a lot of what makes a great sketch is just great acting. I mean, which I've
Like his
noticed.
Trump sketches, are you talking about in
Yes,
particular?
yes. So
I
Alec
agree with you.
Baldwin
I
is
think
great.
Alec Baldwin is probably, uh, I think they were really smart to get him as opposed to a regular cast member to do Donald Trump. What is it that you like about the Alec Baldwin sketches as Trump?
Well, it's Alec Baldwin's a great actor. I mean, same thing with the Larry David sketches where Larry David plays Bernie Sanders. I mean, there were a lot of sketches where Larry David played Bernie Sanders, and they even
I
did
love
like
them.
a short, which is legendary. I think it's
Curb
like
Your
the
Enthusiasm
Curb Your
as
Enthusiasm
Bernie.
meets
Oh,
Bernie
it's
Sanders
brilliant.
sketch. That's
Now, in
amazing.
fairness, they are cousins.
Well, he's great. I mean,
There might be a cousin that you've got, Randall, that can do an amazing Randall Mills.
maybe.
I should start working with him.
Well, it's something I've noticed over the years on SNL is the best sketches that turn out the best are the ones with the best acting. I mean, when you get like I remember, do you remember when Lindsay Lohan did the show SNL
Yeah.
and she was horrible? It's I don't know if she's a terrible actress or what, but she just wasn't good. There's been other examples, like sometimes a musical guest ends up doing sketches, and they're usually terrible.
Unless they're Justin Timberlake, who's freaking brilliant.
Well,
But-
he's an all around performer.
and there's nothing like that when somebody you didn't expect. Surprise! I would agree with you. I think that
I mean, it's
as much
actually
as I want to
acting.
say it's the writing, I agree with you. I think it's the acting. I think you get an actor who can commit to playing a character honestly and truthfully, and there is something about it that transcends the stereotype. They make it their own. It's Saturday Night Live at its best. That's when you're going to talk about it the next night. You're saying, did you see Tina Fey's Sarah Palin? Wasn't that amazing? Or don't you love it when John Mulaney hosts the show and he does a musical number? I love when Tom Hanks is one of my favorites, because you know that when he comes on, he might even create a new one. Was that Jimmy Pumpkin?
Yeah. I don't think that's his name. Rupert Pumpkin?
Rupert, whatever the pumpkin character is. Like that. He was like well into his 60s when he just said, I'm going to do that character. And it's just it becomes a Halloween costume because so many of the great Saturday Night Live characters are just a gesture. Uh,
Well, you go back to some of the strongest actors on the show. You go back to like Dana Carvey and Mike Myers. Okay, they were probably two of the strongest actors in the normal cast of the show. And if you ever look at their old sketches, I mean, their performances are just incredible. I mean, they're probably like 100% better than almost every other performance you've ever seen on the show. I
well,
mean,
certainly they do exactly what Saturday Night Live does best, which is you have two actors who, and Carvey, I believe, is actually from stand up, who their choices get mimicked by school kids and grown-ups for the rest of the day, right? Like how much in the early 90s were people going, what was a tagline that they would do? Way not. Remember, people would just say not.
not
And
right.
like, like
I wasn't even thinking about it, but they were both in the Wayne's World sketches.
yeah, and those
Yeah.
Wayne's World defined in the same way, like so when Steve Martin would do with Dan Aykroyd, the two wild and crazy guys, or when a sketch is really on, and digital shorts, we really haven't even gotten into them, but when a digital short, like wasn't Lazy Sunday like one of the most popular little digital shorts on YouTube back at the beginning, or Dick in a Box, or like you could spend all day watching those Andy Samberg digital shorts, the Lonely Island stuff.
Well, what they did that was smart in a lot of those is they would take like a very good actor, a very good performer, and they would get the best out of them in those shorts.
And they hit in a way that, like, I'll be blunt, they hit in a way that stand-up comics don't hit. They hit in a way that sitcoms don't hit. They even hit in a way that comedy movies don't hit, which is they create this social phenomenon where for a day, a month, a couple of years, people are still quoting them. People quoted the whole Jimmy Liar thing that John Lovitz did for like forever, just because there's they hit something in our psyche.
Some people call sketch comedy a character-based comedy, and so the character is the essence of it, and you really need a strong performer to make that character work. I don't know, Chris. I think Mike Myers might be the strongest performer ever in the history of SNL. And, you look at the characters he created. I mean, it's just, he's jumping off. He's practically jumping off the screen when you watch him.
I would put him and Eddie Murphy and Will Ferrell and Tina Fey and Amy Poehler and Kristen Wiig and Dan Aykroyd and Gilda Radner. I would put all of them really high in that pantheon of people who could just come in and create from whole cloth, and Emily Litella, even John Belushi, how could I forget him? Bill Murray with the Nick the Entertainer. So I think that when satire, and that's really what Saturday Night Live is at its heart, it holds up a mirror. I don't know why I'm doing this with my fingers, but it holds up a mirror to our society and reflects back to us what we're experiencing. And I think it does one of two things. Either it reflects back to us our own experiences and makes fun of them, which they can do really well because you laugh at it, or it does the opposite, where it creates things that are so far removed, like a land shark, like a conehead, like Dieter and Franz, something that is so out of this world that of course you want to see it because you're not seeing the world as you see it, but you see the world as you dream it.
Hey, Hans and Franz, wasn't that another example of a Dana Carvey, Mike Myers sketch?
Yeah, just great stuff. So my last question, it really is a full circle, right? I'm 54, be 55 by the time this comes out. So almost, from the age of 10 to now, I have watched so much Saturday Night Live, not consistently, but I've watched so much. It's been around so much. So if it first came to us with young child eyes, I got to ask you, what does it look like to you today through the eyes of a middle-aged man who has studied sketch comedy, who's done stand-up and sketch and improv like myself, who has gotten to know the real players, who've seen now thousands of episodes? How differently or how similar does it look through your eyes today?
Well, I think Saturday Night Live has tried to grow a little bit through the years. I mean, you can see that with the Alec Baldwin Trump. You can see that with the Larry David, Bernie Sanders. But they do have a demographic they're always trying to appeal to. Um, it
Did we outgrow that demographic,
I
Randall?
I feel I'm getting there, Chris.
I mean, I'm 10 years older than you. And I will say this much, like, and I can only speak to my own experiences. Like, yeah, I watch it now, and I'm sure you do too. And you know the game that they're playing when they're doing their sketch. You understand the rules. You understand how it works. I understand all of the dynamics and principles. Sure. And, now I see people who could be my own kids, So, yeah, I mean, there are some jokes and some humor I don't get. And sometimes I go, man, that's not really that funny. Like, I'm much more hypercritical now because I've spent my whole life toiling in that field. And yet I'm much more grateful now than when I was a kid, because it's harder now to make me laugh at anything. Not in my level of sophistication, like the shows I watch now are the streaming cable shows. The movies that I see that are a comedy are normally the independent films. I have I'm what will make me laugh? I can't laugh at a joke that I thought was funny when I was 30. First off, I don't find the world of adults as funny as I did when I was a kid. I don't, the world's a sad place often now from my perspective, but I won't lie to you. Certainly Weekend Update has been probably the most consistent aspect for me on that show. And also, I don't laugh as much, but when I laugh now, I'm really grateful that I'm laughing. How about you?
Well, yes, I share those sentiments, but I guess there was a time in my life, especially when I was younger. A lot of people in comedy, they look at SNL as like a holy temple, right? It's a sacred temple of comedy, right? And the people that inhabit it are almost like comedy gods. And now when I look at the show, I just see what the show's always been about. I feel is like it's just a bunch of kids playing and having fun.
And
And
maybe that's all comedy should ever be.
well, at least there's one show on TV that it's just young kids playing and having fun. I mean, it would be nice if there were more shows like that, but at least there's one, Chris.
I hear you. Well, I'd love to know how you feel about Saturday Night Live. What were your favorite seasons, your favorite performers, your least favorite seasons, your least favorite performers? We didn't even really get into like the music, which is a whole other deal. But if you got any thoughts, we'll come back and we'll talk about SNL again. Until then, I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
Be well and be safe.
Bye.